Off yesterday. I was working at introducing this bottom nav to switch between users and movies between those two lists. Where we left off, I've kind of hooked up most of it, but there was a little bit outstanding that we need to finish up there. There wasn't too much, so this should be pretty short. So I want to walk through that. I'm going to turn off one of the lights. So if you're following along, you definitely want to open up the project and take a look. Two quick things that I forgot to do yesterday in the setup. One of the things we need to remember to go back and do is change the parents. The parent and child relationships have changed because we introduced this home activity. So I need to go fix that in the manifest. The other thing I forgot to do is in the menu resource, I forgot to extract both of those strings. So I'm going to go do both of those things, and then we'll migrate the code we've got from the activity into the fragment, because as you can see right now, there's really nothing happening with this fragment. The user list isn't being populated anymore because we don't have the code there yet. So first things first, into the manifest, we've got a few activities. We've got home, we've got login. You can see I've got movie list and I've got movie details. I want to rearrange these a little bit because I usually try to arrange these in the order the user passes through them. So home is going to be after login. I'm not setting up a parent there, even though I could if I wanted to. With the movie list, this one in some sense doesn't exist anymore, so one thing I could do is remove it from here. But what I think I might will do, at least for the moment, is just to leave it in and fix kind of the parenting with these two. So in terms of thinking about the parent of this one, I probably would set the parent of this one to home activity. Same thing in the body with the metadata. I might want to say that this is home. So effectively the parent of movie list is the home activity. And projector just died. Turn that back on. Okay. Same thing with the movie details. Basically, the way you're getting to movie details is through home activity now and not through the movie list activity. So I need to update that in both of those places as well. Right. So several of these things now are parented to the home activity instead of parented to movie list and things like that. If you have your, say, My Profile activity, recognize that's also one that's going to need a change, because how do I get to My Profile is now through home instead of through the movie list or through the game list. Make sense? So you'll need to take another look at the parents, the parent-child relationships, and update those based on our new pathways. Okay? Yeah.
How come the value for the movie details and movie list activity is home activity?
So effectively, I'm saying that's the way I'm getting there, right? The reality is that I'm going to be removing the movie list activity entirely, because we're moving all that code over to home activity, right? So in reality, I could even remove that activity and it would be fine, right? I'm just leaving it in place for the moment. Okay. What else? Another thing I need to remember to do in here, remember you want to have a label for all these screens. So I might want to give a label to the home, so that appears in the nav bar. So I might want to say that as home. Similarly, I probably want this to be movie list if I were going to restore it, just to name the two screens. Okay, now once I put those names in, I just need to remember to extract them. So Alt-Enter, let's extract that as home, and let's Alt-Enter, extract that as movie list. So that's just cleaning up the manifest a little bit in terms of the parent, and also making sure that you know which screen you're on by making sure all of those have a label that's different. Cool. So just a little bit of cleanup there that's important to do to help the user navigate around the application. I might also want to, of note, I might also want to set all of these exported to true so that we're able to go there directly should we need to. Okay, cool. So that's cleaning up the manifest. Over to the menu resource. So under home bottom menu, I forgot to extract both of these strings, so I'm going to do that here. So I'm going to do Alt Enter, extract resource, action, or maybe I'll just call this movies. Movies. And I'm going to extract that as users. So just a little bit of cleanup before we dive into the thing we wanted to do. Okay, so I cleaned up the manifest, I cleaned up the menu. I want to go over to two classes now and close all this stuff. We've got, right now, we've got a home activity, we've got the movie list activity, and we also have the movie list fragment, right? So we need to populate this movie list fragment, that class, with some instructions, with some code, right? Which is going to be the main kind of logic behind that screen. Okay. Now, basically, the logic that goes here is going to be very, very similar, if not identical, to the code we have in the activity. So a lot of this is just copy code over to here and tweak it a little bit where it needs to be tweaked. So that's the good news. The other good news is this is one of the reasons why we introduced view models. The more you're using view models, the less code that's in the activity, the easier it is to switch between fragments and activities because there's less difference that way. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's one of those reasons what we've done that. The other reason that there were a few reasons that I just flashing back a little bit to the test, because there was there's a question on the written test. Now that I think about it, one of the questions on the written test was, well, why did we introduce these view models in the first place? Well, this is another reason, right? Another reason is it makes it easier to work with fragments and communicate between fragments. But one of those primary reasons some of those reasons we did it is just cut down on code on the activity. But a big reason why we did it is when you turn your screen sideways, if you do turn your screen sideways, that's called a configuration change. Configuration changes also happen if you change the language. Other things can trigger it as well. But if you have a configuration change, then the entire activity gets destroyed and recreated, but the view model sticks around, right? So if you turn it sideways, you keep the view model, but you don't keep the activity. So any data we have kind of in the view model, we get to keep around. And that means if we're putting all this logic working with the database into the view model, that we don't have to then immediately go back to the database again if you turn the screen sideways and go fetch all that data again. If we do database calls, if we do database work in the activity, two things happen. Hey, we have to redo that. Things also might get aborted midway because you turned it screen sideways. So maybe we're trying to log you out, maybe we're trying to submit your data, submit the review that you just posted, add something to the library. We don't want that to get stopped midway, right? So putting out a view model makes it easier to manage those kind of things and keep those network operations running rather than having to stop them and restart them. Make sense? So a lot of the use of the view model also just has to do with database and network kind of issues where you don't want to lose the data or lose it midway, abort it midway, or do it twice just because you rotated the screen. So that's a very big reason why we do this. Okay, movie list activity. So when we look at the movie list activity, I would start up first and look at our variables, right? We've got a bunch of instance variables here, okay? It turns out that as far as the transition goes, I'm basically, first up, I'm going to copy all of those instance variables over because all those instance variables will now belong to the fragment, and I need that to implement the rest of the code. So I'm going to bring those things over. So I have my constants, I have my references for my views, I've got some state variables, namely for my view model and my adapters. That's still going to be there. One thing that's a little bit different, and it looks like I'm missing, interesting thing I hadn't noticed here, but I think I'm missing one of my adapters. So maybe I'll add that in right now where I'm seeing that. Because I think I had a list adapter. And it looks like maybe I just had that locally. That'd be movie list. Class. Anything there that I need to change, right? Well, looking from top to bottom, well, the log tag's now wrong, right? So obviously the log tag needs to reflect the new class, right? So I'm no longer in movie list activity, I'm in movie list fragment. So I do have to be careful that I change that over. My views will be referencing all the same views. My state will all be same. So largely in part, it's just you're moving from an activity to a fragment, copy all those instance variables over, and just change the log tag. That really should be the only thing you have to change. Next up, if I look at movie list activity, there's a bit of logic in here, right? So there's a logic in onCreate. We also have this logic that's after onCreate, right? Now, the logic outside of onCreate we dealt with yesterday. Remember, that's all kind of menu related. So anything menu related or app bar related is going to go into our new home activity. That's still activity related. So the stuff that moves over is all those instance variables and everything we're doing in onCreate. Good news again with onCreate is this transition is pretty simple. Notice here, set content view is what's setting the particular layout that we're using. So what I'm going to do is take everything after that that's inside of onCreate, just making sure that it's all in onCreate. It's going to be down, for me, that's down to line 146. So I'm looking at line 63 down to line 146. So notice I'm taking most of the body of onCreate, but not necessarily all of it, right? I'm losing those first two lines. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to drop that into here. So I still need to keep the super. Boop. So I have that all the way down to the listeners. And that's almost works, right? So it starts up here with calling super on view created. It ends at the bottom with my listeners, and most of the things in this code file are going to work just out of the box. Not everything, but most things, okay? So there's a little bit of changing we have to do. What's the first error that you see in my code? What's the first error that you see?
Looks like it doesn't have a context.
Doesn't have context, right? That's a good thing to notice. Okay, so one of the things to realize is a fragment is not a context. An activity is a context, but a fragment is not a context, which is a very important distinction. That means anytime you're referring to the context within the scope of a fragment, you have to do special things. Okay. The other thing that means is because the fragment is not a context, you're not guaranteed to always have a context. There are some cases where you may not have a context to work with at all. Okay? So, part of the thing to understand with the life cycle with the fragment is that it is created first, right? And then later attached to the activity. Right? It's later put into the view. And that point where we expand it and we get views, right? At that point, we're kind of attached to the activity. We can get a context. It can happen that at later points in time, say maybe you switch to another page or something like that, you may get detached. Okay, so you also can't rely on that you're going to be attached to a context or attached to an activity indefinitely, right? That's going to happen initially when everything's on screen and while you're there, but eventually you will lose that context. So you do have to be careful with references to context that you're not keeping them around longer than you should. Or you're not assuming that the context is always going to be non-null. Okay? Everybody clear with that? Okay. So this first function that we have here, find view by ID, we were previously calling that on the activity. Well, we don't really have an activity anymore. In fact, I don't really want to call it on the activity. Okay. So where I want to call that on is, notice that this method, onViewCreated, has two arguments. One is the view, and one is this saved instance state. Okay. That first one about the view is the one I need. That view is our inflated layout. That's the layout we set up in the constructor that I wanted to inflate. I want to have movie list as my layout. So that's where I'm gonna get that from. Is I'm gonna say view dot find view by ID. So it's actually not a constant. It's not actually a context that I need for that. It's really a view. It's just in the activity space. There's some magic happening there to kind of make it look like you're getting it from the activity, even though you're actually getting it from the content view. So, okay. Which also you notice, if we looked at what we did on our adapters, we actually did the same thing. We inflated the layout, we got a view, and they were actually calling view find view by ID. Mm-hmm. So the only weird cases in activities, we try to do it on a context, which is kind of the unusual case. Okay. So here we're going to say view dot find view by ID. That's the switch we have to make here. Let's look next. What's the next thing that causes a problem? Okay. So I need to create this linear layout manager for my recycler view. Notice that the linear layout manager requires what? A context. Okay. So I've got two options. I can either get a context to give it, or I can figure out a way to not need one. Okay? Does that make sense? So let's look at our options. Actually, I take that back. So let's look at here. First question to ask oftentimes is to just go look at the thing you're constructing and see if there's another constructor available. Because sometimes you can just construct it with a different constructor. You can provide it a fragment instead of a fragment activity, or whatever the case may be. Now, in the case of this linear layout manager, notice that all its constructors, unfortunately, do require context. So there's no way to just provide it a fragment. It does require a context. Okay? So this is a case where we do have to go get that context. The way we're going to do that here, I'm going to say right before I do that, I'm going to say context. Notice importantly that I'm making this a local variable. That is super, 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 super important. Because if you make it an instance variable, you're going to be keeping this context around far too long. You'll still have it when it's attached. So I'm going to make a local variable. Context is equal to get, I think there's a get activity. Yes. So I want to get activity. And that's going to return me, actually I want to name it that way. That's going to give me back a fragment activity. Maybe I'll call that activity. So get activity will return the activity that I'm currently attached to. Okay. So that activity obviously is a context. That's the thing I want to use here because it's kind of attached. It's kind of is that way. It's attached. Linear layout does have to be attached to effectively the view hierarchy, if that makes any sense. In some cases, you can use what's called the application context safely. This is definitely a case where it's really attached to the view hierarchy, so it really would make more sense to attach it to the activity. Okay, so going further down, where's the next place that we see this? Well, again, if we look at here, I have this reference to this, so that array adapter also needs to be a reference to the activity again. Now, I might want to do one thing up here, rather than blending that call. I might want to just quickly section that out because I'm going to be using that activity in a few different places. Okay, so we use the activity to construct the layout manager. We need that context. We need that activity to also construct the array adapter. If we keep going down, there's another array adapter down here. Now, why is that's interesting? Let's just not copied something over. Did I? Oh, yeah, that's what happened. I just didn't copy it over. Okay, so that adapter, we need the activity. This adapter, we also need the activity. So you're going to see a lot of places where we were referring to this that I have to switch over. I'm going to come back to the observers here in a minute. So I'm going to leave those thises alone for the moment. Is there anything else that needs to be switched over? If I go down to problems, oh yeah, so here's one, because we're kind of working through the adapters. When I create the movie list adapter, remember that I had previously said, hey, we need to get this app.compat activity. I need some sort of context to work with that, right? Maybe it doesn't need to be app.compat activity. In fact, let's look at where do I use that context. So if I'm going to look at where that context gets used, so notice I use it first here. I use it with the layout inflator to say layout inflator from context, okay? That one at the minimum just needs to be a context of some sort. There's some annotation here that says it needs to be a UI context. That has some bearing, so that really means that it's going to be an activity and not just a generic context, not an application context. The other thing that we have is down here, remember when you click on the item, we need to navigate the user over to another activity. See that with the start activity? Well, in order for us to really call start activity, we do need to have that context be an activity, okay? So it is necessary here that be an activity, okay? Now, the problem is over here in the fragment, we no longer have what we previously had, which was we had a subclass of app.compat activity. At this point, we don't know that. We just know it's a subclass of fragment activity. Make sense? So I have a few ways I could go about this. One way I could say is, well, the baseline that we know is if it's an activity, we're good. We should be able to do the start activity. We should be able to do the layout inflator. So one possibility is I could change this type to be activity. Another option is I could change it to be fragment activity, because we know we have that in both places. We know that for sure it's an app, it's that. The other way I could do this is kind of take advantage of up here when I'm calling get activity. Do I know that all my classes are subclasses of app.compat activity? Do I know that for a fact?
Yes, because that's what you did in the base class, right?
Base class. But really, if I create a new class, if I create a new activity in Android Studio, it's always a subclass of AppCompat activity. So one thing I could do up here, I'm going to walk this back in a moment, but one thing I could do is I could just say, hey, I'm just going to make the assumption that it's an AppCompat activity and cast it to that. I could make that assumption, right? And that assumption works as long as the assumption is correct, right? As long as there's nothing that is not a subclass of AppCompat activity. Does that make sense? So if I get that assumption wrong, then the application crashes.
That's only for the activities that are going to connect to this fragment, though, right?
Right.
Okay.
Which turns out to be, in this case, actually only one, right? I'm only using this fragment in the context of HomeActivity. So in fact, I could cast it to HomeActivity. It wouldn't crash at this point, but if I ever wanted to use this fragment on any other activity, that potentially could be a problem. Does that make sense? So this explicit casting is one way to solve it. I generally want to steer away from that where I can. Does that make sense to everybody? Generally, where I can, I want to steer away from that. So rather than trying to cast that to AppCompat activity here, I'm just going to, in my adapter, I'm going to change what our minimum need is. So here, I really just need an activity. In fact, I'm kind of okay with it being any activity. Although, actually, let me backtrack. Let me make that fragment activity. So I'm going to say fragment activity here, fragment activity there. So just changing the type to Defragment activity instead of AppCompat activity, because I don't necessarily know for sure that that's going to be the case, but I know that I want everything to be a fragment activity. So those two switch over to fragment activity. Coming back here, where did I construct that recycler view? Oh, here it is, line 69. So I'm going to pass in the activity there. And now that I've got, now that I've got that activity being fragment activity on both sides, it's happy with the typing. Cool. These are little things that oftentimes you run into at this point when you're starting to move to fragments, is you find that, oh, I assumed something was going to be this kind of activity, and maybe that's not true anymore. Maybe it needs to be more general, right? Because you don't necessarily know what activity you're going to use this fragment on. In fact, we talked about the whole master details things. It might be that I use the list now on two different activities or two different layouts, or the details might be on the same screen as the list, or it might be on a separate screen from the list. So we don't want to make too many assumptions about what the activity is. Cool? Okay. So that switch about context and those kind of things is usually one of the things that throws people off. The next question is, what about this observation? Okay. What about this observe? So this observe, previously we were passing this, right? This being the activity, okay? Now, look at what type that it actually needs. What does it actually need? It needs a lifecycle owner, okay? It needs a lifecycle owner. It doesn't really need a context. It needs a lifecycle owner, okay? Now, their AppCompat activity is an implementation that is a version of a lifecycle owner, so that's why it worked previously. But what it's telling us now is that our fragment is not a lifecycle owner, okay? Our fragment is not a lifecycle owner. So what I want to do is pop into the docs and take a look at that class. Android developers. And you might see that there's a little link here that pops up, a guide. This is related. I am going to drop this into Discord because it's a good read. Talking about handling lifecycle and lifecycle aware components that's related to this topic. I don't believe, let me just check if they talk about fragments in here. Oh, yeah, I knew they did. So one of the things that they mention in here is that lifecycle aware components perform actions in response to changes in lifecycle status or other components, such as activities and fragments. Now note this is like, they're meant this to work with fragments. Like that's part of the core implementation, okay? So there's got to be work here, right? There's got to be some way they expect this to function. When we're talking about the life cycle, we're talking about the fact that these can be created, destroyed. There's a series of things that can happen over the course of the lifetime of the activity or the fragment. But activities and fragments have different life cycles, right? So the way you manage that is a little bit different. I wanted to see, this is where I was looking for fragments. So they mention here that life cycle is about activity and fragment. A life cycle owner there. So life cycle owner is a single method interface that denotes the class has a life cycle. It has one method get life cycle which must be implemented by the class. Try to manage the life cycle of the whole application, instead use process life cycle. So how do I work this with a fragment? It's interesting that that article doesn't mention the thing I want to look at. So I'm going to go over here. Oh, and that is, why is this the old one? There. So when you look up a class in the developer docs, this is what I was trying to get to, you can see information about the interface itself, right? So we can see from this interface that it really just has one method, get lifecycle, okay? We also can see here that there are subclasses, right, implementations of this interface. So, for instance, if we look for app-compat activity, you can see it's listed here as it's one of the things that is a subclass or implements this interface. Make sense? So that's part of why it worked before. Okay. Mm-hmm. But we can also see in there that there's a bunch of other things that also implement this interface. So as long as we are one of those things, or we can get one of those, or provide one of those things, what do you see?
I see fragment activity.
So fragment activity is included.
Yep,
okay. Good. So that's good. Now, I'm kind of... that's interesting. Fragment shows up in the list. So according to this, a fragment is a lifecycle owner. Which one is this? Android X fragment, app fragment. So this is a lifecycle owner. Why is it not happy? Use get-view lifecycle owner as the lifecycle owner. Oh, that's interesting. So what is that function? I'm going to bring that in here. Lifecycle owner.
Fragment.
So it's in Fragment. What does it say? Get lifecycle owner that represents the fragment's view lifecycle. In most cases, this mirrors the lifecycle of the fragment itself, but in cases of detached fragment, the lifecycle of fragment can be considered longer than the lifecycle of the view itself. Okay. So that's what they're asking us to use. So they're ask for a little bit of a different lifecycle than passing the fragment directly. So that's what I need to do, is I need to call getView lifecycle owner. I'm going to save that to a variable, and then I'm going to use that in all of these observers as the first argument to the observer. And so I'm using that in place of the activity. All comes down to there's a difference between the life cycles of activities and fragments because of the attach and detach nature of things. That's the answer. I'm like, this should just work. I'm pretty sure fragments are life cycle owners last I checked, but apparently we have to call this new method. All right, cool. I'm going to tell the application to start running. I'm going to see if this is behaving the way I want it to.
I wasn't paying attention, but did you cut the code out of the movie list activity.java, or did you just copy it?
I just copied it.
Okay.
I just copied it. I mean, at this point, I could really just delete the movie list entirely. I'm not going to do that at the moment, just to keep it around. But I could technically completely delete the movie list because all my code is going to be over in this fragment now.
Okay.
So, there we go. So I have all my code here. I can filter down to put a few things on my list. So if I go to the things I voted on, that's all working here. I can switch there and back, and everything kind of stays in place.
That's cute.
So we've effectively moved all of that code over into the fragment. So you notice that basically for the most part, it's really just copy and paste it over. The thing that gets weird is when you're having to have references to this. Unfortunately, when you're talking about this being the activity, that actually means a lot of things, right? So you're talking about context, you're talking about it doesn't need to be an activity, doesn't need to be a lifecycle owner, and so any reference to this requires a little bit more investigation into what it actually needs, right? So in some cases here I was able to use the activity. In other cases I need to use this lifecycle owner to hook things up, right? Or in the case of recycler view, I also needed to go change the type, so it took a fragment activity instead of outcome activity. Cool. Any questions? Does all kind of make sense so far? Okay. So that's how you're going to get the user list in there, right? So what I want you to do as far as the lab project, one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is fill this in. So this can display a list of users, so I can switch back and forth between your list of games and your list of users. Let me pull the actual lab assignment up because there's 3 parts to it. So first things first, in order to make that user list appear, we need to have data in it, right? So right now, if you haven't made any changes to your code yet, your users collection is probably empty, right? So step 1 is to implement some logic that we talked about yesterday so that when you log in, it will insert or update the user record in the database. That's step 1. So that way you have data there. The next thing I want you to do is implement this kind of home navigation and whatnot that we've built. and you're going to build that as fragments. I think I've previously written this as activities, but please do implement that as the user list fragment. Maybe I just need to create a new fragment. Let me fix that real quick. Fragment. User list fragment. Make sure I highlight that part. So you create a fragment, you're going to use that to display, you're going to use the bottom now that we talked about, and then when you click on a particular profile within the users list, I want that to take you basically to a new activity called user profile activity. So you can see the list of activity, the list of users, and you can go view a particular user, kind of like how you set up the details page, right, for games. Cool. So in some ways, this should be a good amount of repetition of things that you've done, but with a little bit of added new stuff, namely with dealing with fragments and bottom down. Cool.
Is it mine?
Yep.